Hello and welcome to episode 21 of Cold Case Christmas. We're on the home straight now. In this episode, we are going to Lincoln, Massachusetts. The year is 1961, and the person we're concerned with was a 31-year-old married mother who disappeared under the most suspicious circumstances you could possibly imagine. I have no idea what to make of this one. It is such a strange case. The woman was called Joan Risch. Let's tell her story. Joan was born Joan Carolyn Bard on May 12, 1930 in Brooklyn, New York. Her family moved to New Jersey when she was 9 years old, and within months after the move, Joan sadly was orphaned, as both of her parents died in 1940 in a suspicious fire. I don't have any other details about the fire, why people think it's suspicious, but Joan was orphaned and she was adopted by her aunt and uncle. She took their last name, so became Joan Carolyn Nattrass. Now, some reports say that she first lived in foster care before she was adopted by her aunt and uncle. And some reports claim that Joan had said that she'd been sexually abused by possibly her foster father or possibly her uncle. I'm not sure which. But those claims, whoever it was, has never been confirmed. But despite this tragic start to her life, she just got on with it. She was a very clever woman. Very ambitious. She graduated from Wilson College in Pennsylvania in 1952 with an English literature degree. She absolutely loved reading. And this becomes relevant, actually, later on in this case. So she wanted to go and work in publishing. She got a start in the publishing world as a secretary. And because she was so ambitious and she was good at what she did, she worked her way up until she became the editorial assistant at the publishing company Harcourt, Brace and World. She later moved jobs and she met her future husband, Martin Risch. She married him in 1956. She left the publishing world behind in 1959 when they had their first child, a girl called Lillian. They'd moved by this time to Ridgefield in Connecticut. And a year later, they had a son, David. They then moved to Lincoln, Massachusetts in April of 1961. Joan was described by people in the community as friendly, but somewhat reserved. It took her a while to warm up to people, but she fit in and she became an active member in the League of Women Voters. Martin had begun working at the Fitchburg paper company. This took him all over and out of state. So Joan was very often left alone for days on end with the two children. Joan did want to go back to work when Lillian and David were a little bit older, and she decided that she wanted to become a teacher so that she could share with children her love of learning and, in particular, her love of reading. But unfortunately, that wasn't to be, because what happened on October 24th, 1961. So here's how that day went down. And it started like any other day, perfectly normal, somewhat mundane, really. But by the day's end, the most bizarre scene was left at Joan Risch's house, and Joan was nowhere to be found. Martin got up and drove to Logan Airport to catch his flight at 8 a.m. He was going on a work trip to New York. He intended to stay there overnight in Manhattan and come back the following day. So whatever happened to Joan, Martin was not involved. He was in New York. He could verify that. Plane tickets, multiple people saw him. So he's off the list of potential suspects. Okay. Joan and the kids got up. They had breakfast like every morning. She dropped her son off, little baby David, with a neighbour, Barbara Barker, her friend across the road. They had kids the same age. They became friendly. And this morning, David was being looked after by Barbara because both Joan and Lillian had dentist appointments. So Joan drove her blue 1951 Chevrolet to the dentist. After the dentist, they did a little bit of shopping and they went back home. She was home by 11. She went to collect David, so Barbara saw her. She was seen by a couple of tradesmen and both said that she was just normal, fine. A woman in good spirits, nothing untoward. While they were out, they'd had a couple of deliveries. The mailman and the milkman had both been by, and they said that they didn't notice anything strange about the house, nobody peculiar hanging out, nobody trying to break in, no strange cars in the neighbourhood, nothing. Shortly after 11:15 a.m, a dry cleaner delivery driver came by the home to pick up a few of Martin's suits that were going to be dry cleaned. He entered the home briefly to pick them up. Everything was fine. He only stepped into the hallway, I guess, but everything was fine. Joan was fine. The kids were fine. The house looked in good order. Joan made lunch, and then David went for his afternoon nap, because he's only a little baby, just after noon, and he normally slept for a couple of hours. Around 1 p.m, neighbour, Barbara, brought her son, Douglas, who was the same age as Lillian, the little girl, over to play, like a little play date, little cute play date. So Lillian and Douglas, even though it was October, it was a nice day, and they were playing outside in the yard, and Joan was overseeing them, pruning some plants, doing a little, light gardening, as you do. It's around 2 p.m. that things start getting wacky. Joan took the kids back over to Barbara's. Now, Joan was meant to be looking after Douglas on this little play date for the afternoon. But unbeknownst to Barbara, Joan had taken the kids back to Barbara's and just left them in the yard. Like, not knocked on Barbara's door or anything to say that, I don't know, she had to go out and, she's bringing Douglas back and could she please look after Lillian. But remember, David's in the house asleep. So if she had to go out, where's David? You know what I mean? So, no, she didn't tell Barbara that she dropped these two kids, Barbara's own son and her daughter, in the yard. Barbara does see, however, that around 2:15, now remember, she's unaware Lillian and Douglas are playing in her backyard. But she sees Joan coming out of her house in a trench coat, carrying something red from the car to the garage. So she'd been out to the car, and Barbara's just happens to be looking out of her front window and sees Joan with this red thing in her arms. And it was only a brief glance, but she said that Joan looked dazed and kind of was walking quickly. It was just a little bit odd, struck her as a little bit odd, but she thought, well, the kids are inside, including her own son. Maybe she's walking quickly because she's doing this little quick errand in the garage and she wants to get straight back to the kids. And that is the last confirmed sighting of Joan. There was a girl called Virginia who was a daughter of one of Joan's neighbours who got off the bus about an hour later, claims to have seen an unfamiliar car, like this two-toned, potentially General Motors model of some kind, in the driveway of Joan's house. Now, lots of people who've covered this case have made so much of this two-toned car that was seen in the Risch's driveway that afternoon. And I think there was someone else, some other witness, that had seen a similar car in the neighbourhood a few days previous. But the police have disputed this. They said that this witness got her time wrong, and they claimed it was actually an unmarked police car that presumably had come to investigate what happened. So anyway, during this time, Barbara realises that Lillian and her own son Douglas are playing in her backyard when they're meant to be over at Joan's. So she thinks, okay, that's odd. So at 3:40, she had to go and run some errands of her own, so she dropped Lillian off back at her own house. Like, she took her to the door and the door was unlocked, so Lillian went in on her own. Lillian came back out saying that Mommy wasn't there and that the kitchen was covered in red paint. So Barbara was like, what? So she went in, and the first thing that struck her was she could hear baby David crying upstairs. So this would have been around 4ish. Baby David had been up in his room since noon, needed a diaper change, needed feeding probably. But then she went into the kitchen. There was smeared blood all over the kitchen. So the cops were called at 4:33 p.m. Sergeant Mike McHugh was the first to arrive, and he was hit by not only the blood in the kitchen, which was all over the place, like on the floor, on the walls, on the phone, which had been ripped out of the wall and thrown into a garbage can, which was in the middle of the floor. The chairs had been messed around with, so it just looked like a struggle had taken place there. There was also blood up the stairs as well, and also a little bit on the driveway. Had Joan been attacked? It looked very much like it, but if she'd been attacked in her house, well, where was she? The police's first theory was that she had been attacked in the house and an abductor had then kidnapped her, because there wasn't enough blood, like after tests were done, there wasn't enough blood for it to have been fatal. Even though it seemed like there was a lot, it looked worse than it probably was because it had been smeared. There'd been an attempt to clean up the blood on the kitchen floor. Well, that's not something an abductor would do, honestly. I don't think generally abductors, if they're going to attack you and then kidnap you, they're not going to clean up as well. But there had been this attempt, so I find that odd. But anyway, the estimate of the amount of blood was between a half a pint and 1 pint of blood. You lose a pint of blood when you donate blood, so it's certainly not a lethal amount. Now, remember, we're back in the 60s here, 1961. There was no DNA testing at that point, so all they could do was test the blood type, and the blood type was type O. Like, all this blood in the house was type O. It's the same blood type that Joan had. However, blood type O is very common, so doesn't necessarily mean that it was Joan's blood. Later testing speculated that it appeared to be menstrual blood, but I don't know whether that was ever confirmed. They found a palm print in some of this blood and also a fingerprint. They weren't able to identify whether they were Joan's or not, because she'd never committed a crime, her fingerprints weren't on file, but it also didn't match Martin's or the kids'. There was also no bloody footprints, so neither Joan nor the abductor, if there even was one, had stood in this blood. The abductor scenario was one of the police's first theory. Also, there was suicide. They discounted that pretty quickly. Why would she have left all this blood in the house and then just run away somewhere to commit suicide? It kind of didn't make sense. Anyway, so there was an APB out to look for a woman of Joan's description. 31 years of age, white female, 5'7", around 120 pounds. She had blue eyes and short, dark brown hair. And according to Barbara, she was last seen wearing a grey trench coat, and underneath that she had a sweater, or potentially a blouse, and a charcoal coloured wool skirt, blue sneakers with white piping. The search for Joan was initiated, and they awaited potential witnesses, anybody who might have seen her. Martin, of course, was called, and he flew straight back home to be with his kids and to assist in the search. He obviously was ruled out as a suspect because he was in New York. He was in a different state, so he's definitely ruled out. Alright, so there were some possible sightings. That afternoon around 2:45, several witnesses, not just one, several witnesses claimed to have seen a woman wearing similar clothing, similar size, in the trench coat, but with a covering on her head, potentially a handkerchief. Right, it could have been a hat, but potentially a handkerchief, looking messy and walking like hunched over. Another reported sighting between 3:15 and 3:30. A woman dressed, similar clothing, with blood running down her legs. I don't know, if I'd seen somebody with blood running down the legs, I might want to stop and ask if they were alright, but I don't know. This witness said that the woman seemed to be disoriented and potentially was cradling something at stomach level. 4:30, another sighting of a woman matching Joan's description was seen walking south along Route 128. So we got numerous sightings of a woman potentially bleeding down her legs, potentially cradling something or hunched over. What on earth is going on? So what are the theories? Abduction, suicide, those were the two police theories. I don't think either of those, honestly. Attack a woman in her own home, why would they risk being seen with that same woman? That doesn't make sense. I also don't see suicide, or else I think they would have found a body. Another theory was that Joan had had an illegal abortion. And this wasn't menstrual blood, it was post-abortion blood, like a hemorrhage. There's kind of lots of variations to this theory. One is that in the morning, in addition to going to the dentist, she also went for an abortion. But she had Lillian with her. And she was fine. She got home at 11 a.m. and numerous people saw her. Another version is that a doctor came to the house to give her an illegal abortion while David was napping. And that's why she took Lillian over to Barbara's but didn't tell her. So when the abortion went wrong, the doctor took her to kill her to get rid of the evidence. Another variation, which personally I think is more plausible, that Joan was pregnant, but she didn't want a third child because she had 2 young children. And she was ambitious. She wanted to go back to work. And maybe she didn't want a third child because that would delay her going back to the workplace. And maybe she tried to give herself an abortion. It went wrong. She absolutely panicked, freaked out, and it really was Joan that was seen wandering around that afternoon. Maybe she died somewhere. Why has the body never been found? I don't know. The other very intriguing theory is that she did a Gone Girl, kind of. That she staged her own disappearance. And this is fueled a little bit by what Joan had been reading in the weeks before her disappearance. Over the summer months, Joan had checked out 25 different library books. Now that's not unusual because she was a voracious reader. But quite a few of the books were about women who disappeared without a trace. And one of them, at least one of them, had shocking similarities to Joan's own case. Described how a woman had left behind blood smears and a bloody towel before she went missing. Now, look, Martin said that Joan just liked mysteries. She liked mystery novels and, reading about these kind of true cases. So I don't necessarily read anything into that. You'd have to be good to stage that and then just wander away. Because she didn't take her car. Why wouldn't she have taken her car? Like, she just walked off. So she'd have to have it all planned out. And there's no evidence at all that she had anything planned. Now, obviously, her family said there's no way that she'd abandon her children. But if she wanted to start a new life, then obviously she potentially could. And it's 1961, so it would be easier to just change your name and blend in elsewhere. I don't know. I think it's more likely that she had some kind of mental health crisis, but why would that come on so suddenly? I think that a self-administered abortion could be the thing. I don't know. The case remains unsolved. But Martin, though, he stayed in that house for years. He thought that one day she'd come home. But he died. He died in 2009, so he went to his grave not knowing what happened to Joan. And the case remains unsolved, unresolved to this day. What do you think? What do you think the most likely scenario is here with this very strange, confusing case? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.